Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to the tragedy of the world's deadliest airshow. Now, I've been wanting to go to an airshow for a while. There's one in Wales. I think it's called the Loop Ring or something like that, or the Hyperloop or something like that. But yeah, I've just not managed to find the time yet. But I've heard that there's been some crazy incidents that have happened at air shows. I mean, in particular, like this one here, like I'm guessing there's going to have been some kind of crash, you know, but hopefully I was going to say hopefully the pilot managed to eject, but from the title of the video, it sounds like he didn't.
A fighter jet roars out of a barrel roll so close to the ground that it clips a tree branch with its wing. Thousands of excited spectators watch in disbelief. But inside the cockpit, the pilot screams. This isn't a stunt. What happened next became the deadliest airshow disaster in history. Just hours earlier, the mood at Lviv Airfield couldn't have been more different. To mark the 60th anniversary of the 14th Air Corps, the Ukrainian military organized a grand celebration. Flying the Sukhoi Su-27, a fighter jet capable of dazzling stunts like the Pugachev's Cobra, they are set to deliver a breathtaking display of national pride. But beneath the surface, cracks in the event's planning are already showing. Volodymyr Topanar, a seasoned pilot with 27 years of experience, had asked for practice flights at Lviv Airfield to get familiar with the layout. But the Air Force denied his request because it was too expensive. Since it was a military affair, Topanar didn't protest. This might sound dangerous to the general public, but not for a senior pilot in the Ukrainian Air Force.
Why wouldn't they just give him a few goes? Like, it just seems, let him, you know, why just let him get familiar?
He was briefed on the area using military-grade intelligence and had performed his planned routine countless times. For a pilot like him, unfamiliar territory isn't exactly unusual. After all, you don't get practice runs in a war zone. Things only got worse. On the day, organizers switched the show's location from one side of the airfield to the other at the last minute. This includes moving the spectator zones. These changes are rushed and chaotic, and neither Topanar nor his co-pilot, Yuri Yegorov, have been told about them. Even with his adaptability, Topanar feels uneasy. In the days leading up, local pilots familiar with the site had raised concerns, describing the event's organization as chaotic at best. One even pulled out of the show altogether, citing poor preparation. It's becoming clear that the show is suffering from a shockingly poor standard of organization and planning. But despite these problems, Topanar pushes forward, focusing on the show's finale, a complex routine of loops, rolls, and a daring low pass over the crowd. It has been a successful show to this point. The pilots approach Lviv Airfield to begin their routine, but as they enter the airfield, radio responses make it clear that the site's layout doesn't meet their expectation. With over 8,000 people on the ground, including senior military officials, you'd think they'd be hard to miss. But from the cockpit, Topanar and Yegorov can't see the crowd at all. A potentially deadly situation for those below. When Topanar finally spots the audience, they're not where he expected. They're on the opposite side of the plane. To make matters worse, the flight parameters provided by the Air Force don't match the actual terrain on the ground.
Man, this is so slapdash and unprofessional, isn't it? Like, it's very, very poor planning.
Under pressure to complete the routine, the pilots contact air traffic control for guidance. Ignoring the apparent confusion, controllers tell the pair to continue executing maneuvers. And military pilots are taught to follow orders, which they do despite blatant safety violations. Topanar and Yegorov faultlessly perform their routine for several minutes, but they soon run into trouble when they attempt to execute a standard aerobatic move. During a half-barrel roll, Topanar notices that both engines have decreased thrust, which causes their airspeed to fall. Flying slower than usual, the pair descends to 200 meters above ground level before immediately pulling up to enter a loop with a turn. The move is supposed to run parallel to the spectators. However, given the mismatched layout compared to their flight plans, they are flying head-on towards a large group of people instead.
Man.
As the plane exits the loop, it continues descending at high speed. Topinar fights to gain control of the jet, but it's getting too close to the ground.
Why can't he pull up?
With the plane beginning to level out, it looks like the pilots might avoid catastrophe.
That's a gorgeous plane. I mean, I know this is like unrelated, but isn't that a gorgeous plane? I love the camo look.
But as they approach the tree line in front of spectators, it's clear they are too low to regain altitude in time. The jet's left wing strikes a tree branch and veers toward the ground. Amazingly, the wingtip touches the concrete, and the plane briefly levels out, flying inches above the ground. But the situation is beyond saving. Topinar cannot pull up, and the jet rushes past bystanders towards a parked transport plane. With nothing they can do, Yegorov pulls the ejector toggle just before their jet collides with a parked aircraft. With this final act, disaster strikes. On impact, their jet cartwheels into the air. After several rotations, it slams into the ground and explodes, hurtling into onlookers at high speed.
And
if this wasn't bad enough, the debris manages to catch and drag a barbed wire section along the asphalt, casting a morbid net of destruction. While some try to escape the carnage, others are frozen while they watch as scorching jet fuel, shrapnel, and barbed wire fencing rip through a crowd consisting of many local families. When the wreckage finally comes to a stop, the immediate aftermath is shocking. So much so that some bystanders still struggle with the mental effects of what they saw. People cry out for relatives they'll never see again, and others simply walk away, unable to bear the sight of dismembered loved ones. In some cases, the deceased are beyond recognition. In the crowd, a veteran pilot watches the plane as it crashes. He arrived at the show with his wife and 3 children, but tragically left the show with only 2 surviving sons.
My first thought was my wife and son. The runway was full of human remains. It was hell.
Topinar and Yegorov escape unharmed, landing several hundred feet from the wreckage. The ejector seats saved their lives. It's impossible to imagine the thoughts going through their minds as emergency services tried to deal with the chaos unfolding before them.
I really hope they didn't get in trouble for this, because this is the fault of the planners. Like, the pilots, they couldn't have done any different here.
Over the following weeks, details slowly emerged about the cause of the accident. There was national outrage over the loss of life, and the Ukrainian president promised repercussions for both the senior and little men responsible in the Ukrainian military. It's not like the dangers of an air show weren't well known. By 2002, after several tragedies had led to well-defined safety guides, planes were never supposed to fly directly over crowds or approach them head-on. Spectators needed to be placed far from danger, and display areas required clear escape routes for aircraft in case of emergencies. On top of that, pilots were expected to maintain strict flight distances and only attempt maneuvers they could safely execute. But at the Sknyliv Air Show, it was clear from the start that these precautions were being ignored. Planes flew over the crowd repeatedly, and spectators had been gathered on both sides of the runway, leaving no safe margin for error and no clear escape path for a plane in distress. It was a disaster waiting to happen.
I just don't understand why the organizers didn't just plan it properly. Like, didn't they do a simple sort of like, oh, if we don't plan this and this goes wrong, how could this affect us? Like, it just seems a bit odd that they would, ignore all of the, basic precautions, don't you think?
When the dust settled, the head of the Air Force was dismissed and blame fell squarely on the pilots. Topinar, in particular, became the scapegoat, accused of breaching flight rules and attempting a dangerous maneuver at low altitude.
Way.
But the full picture of what happened and why was far more complicated. Topinar wasn't some rookie pilot making careless mistakes.
He had like
With 27 years of experience, he had performed every maneuver in that day's routine many times before without incident. Allegedly, evidence even showed he performed them correctly during the flight. Yet this was disregarded at his trial. The 3 judges overseeing it, as employees of the Ministry of Defense, were closely tied to the institution under scrutiny. So, what went wrong? 3 key factors stood out. First, the information provided to the pilots was incorrect. Topinar was given the wrong crowd placement and aerodrome layout, leaving him unsure of where spectators were positioned. He repeatedly radioed air traffic control for confirmation, but was
where they
told to
were.
carry on flying. This miscommunication significantly increased danger to the people below. Second, the Su-27 fighter jet he was flying lost power mid-flight. Investigators acknowledged this.
So that's why he couldn't regain thrust to go higher.
But little effort was made to uncover why the plane suffered such a critical failure. The truth remains unknown. What we do know is that the aircraft itself was a problem. By 2002, Ukraine's military fleet was composed largely of aging Soviet-era leftovers, and only 15% of the 700 planes were considered fit for operation. The Su-27 flown at Sknyliv had undergone faulty maintenance, and its engine RPM was reportedly lower than it should have been at the time of the crash. Topinar later argued that he reported these issues mid-flight, but was ordered by ground control to continue the routine.
Man, these people, the organizers really should be the only people responsible here, because it just feels like everything was their fault. Like they didn't tell the pilots where the people were. They didn't, make sure the planes were safe to fly. It's just...
Plane, he claimed, eventually became uncontrollable. And while more problems with the jet may have existed, the military investigation was unlikely to uncover or admit to them. Finally, the event itself was poorly planned from the start. There were no proper safety margins, and the crowd had been placed dangerously close to the action. These issues were evident to the experienced pilots in attendance, some of whom even refused to fly in the show. Yet, the priority for the organizers and controllers was to keep the event going, regardless of the risks. Despite these overwhelming systemic failures, the inquiry focused narrowly on Topinar. He was blamed for breaching regulations, even though the unsafe conditions weren't of his making. At his trial, prosecutors ignored evidence of his correct maneuvers and instead painted him as reckless. That said, Topinar's decisions weren't without fault. Moments before the crash, he acknowledged the jet had an engine problem and lacked the airspeed necessary for his next maneuver. Yet, he still attempted a high-risk stunt at low altitude.
But isn't that because they told him to carry on with the show? I know that he could have landed the plane and refused, but they told him, didn't they? They told him over the radio to carry on flying.
A decision that ultimately sealed the fate of the Su-27 and the people on the ground. The result of this final poor decision was the deaths of 77 people and a further 543 injuries. Children were made orphans, and parents left on the airfield childless.
That's crazy.
Although the president and the public had their figures to blame, the state's handling of the accident wasn't without its criticism. To begin with, the victims of the crash received questionable support. The state only allocated the equivalent of $200,000 to be shared between the families of the deceased.
What? 200 grand? Like between 77 people? That's not a lot, really. That's like, what, 15 grand a pup? You've lost your kids. Like, that's nowhere near enough.
According to recipients, each family's share appeared utterly random, with payments ranging from $7,000 to $40,000 for no apparent reason. Even less money was allocated to the injured, who received extremely low payments to help with medical care. In one of the worst examples, a 4-year-old child was found lying on deceased bodies at the airfield. The trauma of the disaster affected his speech and impeded his mental development, yet his family was only compensated the equivalent of $2,000
That's insane, mate. That's just insane.
by the Ukrainian government. Thankfully, no airshow accidents have even come close to the casualty toll at Sknyliv, but it's doubtful that true justice was served. Topinar was sentenced to 14 years in prison.
What? Oh no, that's just...
Whereas Yegorov received an 8-year jail term. It also found 3 other officials guilty of failing to follow orders, negligence, and violating flight rules. All 3 were jailed for between 4 and 6 years. The pressure to continue the show would have come from senior officials in the military. It's also doubtful that only 3 officials were involved in negligence in the build-up to and during the show. No official information regarding the display line and its separation from the crowd has been released. Equally, the investigation results and final report remain unpublished. Topinar is the only person who served the entirety of his jail term. He has to report to authorities once a month, is working to pay off millions in fines, and commutes to work on rollerblades as he's banned from driving vehicles, including bicycles. By comparison, Yegorov and 2 senior officials were released early. Another only received a suspension.
Wow, man, that is corruption at its core. That's insane that Topinar got that kind of punishment, and the others got basically a slap on the wrist compared. That's wild.
Jail sentence and still works in the Air Force today. Watch this episode next.
Topinar, man. In no way am I saying Topinar is, devoid of blame here, because he could have landed the plane, taken whatever punishment, for not complying, and potentially, people would have not died. But for him to get the brunt of that punishment is just so unfair. Like, the people who made the decisions, who planned it, they should be the ones, to get that punishment. But obviously they've got connections, friends in the courts, in high places. This is just corruption, really. Wild that he can't even ride a bicycle to get to work. So he has to pay off millions in fines, but he can't even ride a bike to go to work to pay those fines? Crazy. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.